Margaret O'Sullivan had always been drawn to the vastness of the Texas frontier, even when everyone warned her against it. In 1847, at 23, she possessed the kind of stubborn determination that made her pack her few belongings and follow her late husband's dream of settling near the Brazos River. Thomas had died of fever just 3 months after their wedding, but Margaret refused to return to her family's cramped tenement in Boston. She would honor his memory by making their shared dream a reality, even if it meant facing the wilderness alone. The small cabin Thomas had begun building sat on a modest plot of land about 15 miles from the nearest settlement of Cedar Falls. Margaret spent her first months completing what her husband had started, learning to handle tools with hands that had once known only needlework and piano keys. The isolation was profound, broken only by weekly trips to town for supplies and the occasional visit from traveling merchants or circuit preachers. Margaret had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Cedar Falls spoke in hushed tones about the Comanche raids, the stolen children, the burned homesteads. But she had also heard different stories from old-timers who spoke of trade and mutual respect in earlier days, before the push westward had turned cooperation into conflict. Margaret tried to keep an open mind, though she kept her husband's rifle loaded and within reach at all times. It was during her 4th month on the homestead, in late autumn when the mesquite trees had turned golden and the air carried the first hint of winter, that Margaret's life took an unexpected turn. She had been tending to her small vegetable garden, harvesting the last of the squash and beans before the first frost, when she heard something that made her blood run cold. At first she thought it was the wind playing tricks, carrying sounds from some distant place. But as she straightened up from her work, brushing dirt from her calloused hands, she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a child crying. Not the brief wail of a youngster who had stumbled and scraped a knee, but the desperate, terrified sobbing of someone in genuine distress. Margaret dropped her basket of vegetables and grabbed the rifle from where she had propped it against the garden fence. Moving carefully toward the sound, she pushed through the thick brush that bordered her property, her heart hammering against her ribs. The crying grew louder, more urgent, and underneath it she could hear something else that made her skin crawl, the yipping and snarling of coyotes. She found them in a small clearing about 100 yards from her cabin. 3 coyotes had cornered a child who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The boy was backed against a large boulder, clutching what appeared to be a broken lance or spear shaft. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with tears and dirt, and Margaret could see blood on his leg where one of the animals had already made contact. The child's appearance told Margaret immediately that he was Comanche, his dark hair hung in braids, and despite his terror, there was something proud and defiant in the way he faced his attackers. One of the coyotes, a large male with scarred flanks, was clearly the pack leader. It paced back and forth in front of the boy, lips pulled back to reveal yellowed fangs, waiting for the right moment to make its final attack. Margaret didn't hesitate. She raised her rifle and fired, the shot echoing across the landscape like thunder. The largest coyote dropped instantly, and the other two scattered into the brush, their courage evaporating with the sharp crack of gunpowder. The boy startled at the sound but remained pressed against the rock, his dark eyes wide as they fixed on Margaret. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the clearing. Margaret kept her rifle lowered but ready, unsure of what to expect. The child was clearly lost, probably separated from his tribe, but she had no way of knowing if rescue was coming or if taking him in might bring danger to her door. Stories of Comanche raids often began with seemingly innocent encounters. But looking at the boy's frightened face, seeing the way he favored his injured leg, Margaret felt her maternal instincts overwhelm her caution. She had lost two bobbies in the early years of her marriage, both to fever, and perhaps that loss made her more sensitive to a child's vulnerability. Slowly, she approached the boy, making soft, soothing sounds the way she might to calm a frightened animal. The child watched her warily but didn't run. When Margaret got close enough, she could see that his leg wound, while bloody, wasn't too deep. The coyote had torn his leather leggings and scraped the skin, but it would heal cleanly if properly tended. She gestured toward her cabin, speaking softly even though she knew he probably couldn't understand her words. "It's all right," she said gently. "I won't hurt you, let me help." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because after a moment's hesitation, the boy allowed her to help him to his feet. He was lighter than she expected, and she could feel him trembling as she supported his weight. Together, they made their way back to her cabin, the boy limping heavily but determined not to show weakness. Inside, Margaret settled the child on her kitchen chair and began gathering supplies to clean his wound. She heated water on the stove, tore clean strips from one of her petticoats for bandages, and retrieved the small bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. The boy watched her every movement with sharp intelligence, his fear gradually giving way to curiosity. As Margaret cleaned his wound, she found herself talking to him, maintaining a steady stream of gentle chatter that seemed to soothe them both. She told him about her garden, about the weather, about her cat Duchess who had gone missing the week before. The boy didn't respond verbally, but she caught him almost smiling when she described Duchess's habit of stalking grasshoppers with elaborate stealth. When the wound was clean and bandaged, Margaret offered the boy food. She heated soup left over from her midday meal and sliced bread she had baked that morning. The child ate with obvious hunger, though he maintained careful manners that spoke well of his upbringing. Margaret found herself wondering about his family, whether they were searching for him, whether they feared him dead. As evening approached, Margaret faced a dilemma. She couldn't simply send the boy back into the wilderness. He was injured, clearly lost, and night brought predators far more dangerous than coyotes. But keeping him might be seen as an act of aggression by his people, assuming they came looking for him. Still, she couldn't abandon a child, regardless of the potential consequences. She made up a bed for him on the floor near her fireplace, using spare blankets and pillows to make it as comfortable as possible. The boy seemed to understand her intention and settled down without protest, though Margaret noticed he kept his broken spear shaft within arm's reach. Even injured and alone, he wasn't defenseless. That first night, Margaret barely slept. Every sound from outside made her reach for her rifle, wondering if Comanche warriors were surrounding her cabin, preparing to reclaim their lost child and exact revenge on the white woman who had taken him in. But the night passed quietly, broken only by the boy's occasional whimpering in his sleep, dreams that were probably filled with coyotes and fear. Morning brought new challenges. The boy's leg was stiff and sore, making movement painful, but he refused to stay in bed. He followed Margaret around the cabin and yard, watching her morning chores with the same intense attention he had shown the night before. Margaret began to suspect that he understood more English than he let on, because he often responded to her requests before she finished speaking. By the third day, a routine had developed between them. The boy, whom Margaret had begun calling Little Eagle in her mind, though she didn't know his real name, helped with simple tasks around the homestead. He was surprisingly useful, showing her more efficient ways to gather kindling and helping her identify edible plants she hadn't recognized. In return, Margaret continued to tend his wound and make sure he ate regularly. But Margaret knew this situation couldn't last indefinitely. Every day that passed without the boy's family finding him increased the likelihood of misunderstanding and conflict. She had heard too many stories of settlers killed because of perceived slights or misinterpreted actions. At the same time, she couldn't bring herself to simply abandon the child to find his own way home. On the fourth morning, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She would take the boy into Cedar Falls and ask for help from the Indian agent who occasionally passed through town. It was risky. Many townspeople already viewed her frontier lifestyle with suspicion, and harboring a Comanche child would only fuel their disapproval. But it seemed like the only responsible course of action. She was preparing for the journey, packing supplies, and trying to explain her intentions to the boy through gestures and simple words, when she heard something that made every drop of blood in her veins turn to ice water. It started as a distant rumble, like thunder from a far-off storm, but gradually resolved into something far more ominous, the sound of many horses approaching at speed. Margaret grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What she saw when she peered through the glass made her knees weak with terror. Coming across the prairie toward her cabin was a sight that belonged in her worst nightmares: dozens upon dozens of Comanche warriors, their horses kicking up a cloud of dust that darkened the morning sky. At the head of the war party rode a man who could only be a chief, his presence commanding even at a distance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face painted for war, eagle feathers streaming from his hair. A magnificent headdress marked his status, and the weapon in his hand caught the sunlight like a blade of judgment. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to count the approaching riders. 50, 70, 100. It was impossible to tell through the dust and distance, but there were far too many for her to fight or flee. This was clearly a war party of significant size, and Margaret had no doubt about why they had come. They wanted their child back, and they probably intended to make an example of the white woman who had taken him. The boy had moved to stand beside her at the window, his face grave as he recognized the approaching riders. For the first time since she had found him, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but clear enough for Margaret to understand the single word he uttered. "Father." The word hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Father. Margaret felt her legs threaten to give way as the full implications crashed over her. She hadn't just rescued any lost Comanche child. She had saved the son of what appeared to be a war chief, a man whose authority was announced by the massive war party thundering toward her humble cabin. Through the window, Margaret could now make out individual details that made her situation seem even more hopeless. The lead rider's horse was a magnificent black stallion that moved with the fluid grace of an animal bred for war. The man astride it sat with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute command, his painted face a mask of controlled fury that promised swift and terrible justice. Behind him rode warriors whose very appearance spoke of countless battles and hard-won victories. Their horses were painted with symbols Margaret didn't understand, but their meaning was clear enough. These men had come prepared for war. Lance points glinted in the morning sun, and she could see the distinctive curved bows that had made Comanche horsemen legendary across the frontier. Margaret's mind raced through her limited options, each one seeming more futile than the last. She could barricade herself inside the cabin and try to hold them off, but her modest home would never withstand an assault by so many warriors. She could attempt to flee, but on foot with an injured child. She wouldn't make it 100 yards before being overtaken. Fighting was suicide, running was impossible, and surrender might be the slowest death of all. Beside her, the boy Little Eagle, as she still thought of him, pressed his face to the window glass, his expression unreadable. Margaret wondered what he was thinking, whether he was relieved to see his father or terrified of what might happen to the woman who had sheltered him. The relationship between parent and child among the Comanche was something Margaret knew little about, but she had heard stories of fierce loyalty and equally fierce justice. The war party was close enough now that Margaret could hear individual voices calling out in the Comanche language, harsh syllables that seemed to carry weight and authority. The dust cloud they raised had settled somewhat, allowing her to get a better count of their numbers. Her estimate had been conservative. There were easily 100 warriors, possibly more, stretching back across the prairie in a formation that spoke of military precision. "What do I do?" Margaret whispered, more to herself than to the boy. "How do I make them understand?" The child looked up at her with those dark, intelligent eyes that had first captured her sympathy. For a moment, she saw past his youth to something older and wiser, as if the trials of recent days had aged him beyond his years. When he spoke, his English was halting but unmistakable. "You, good woman," he said carefully, "you saved 2 hawks, father, he knows." Margaret stared at him in shock. 2 hawks, so that was his name, and he could speak English far better than he had let on during their days together. She realized he had been watching and learning, probably understanding every word she had spoken to him. The thought should have been alarming, but instead it filled her with a strange sense of hope. "2 hawks," she repeated softly. "Is that really your name?" The boy nodded solemnly. "2 hawks flying, son of Chief Running Bear." He gestured toward the approaching war party. "Father comes with many warriors, very angry, very worried." The war party had reached the edge of Margaret's property now, close enough that she could see the intricate beadwork on their clothing and the detailed paintings on their horses. They had spread out in a wide semicircle that effectively surrounded her cabin, cutting off any possible escape route. The message was clear. There would be no running from this confrontation. Chief Running Bear raised his hand, and the entire war party came to a halt with discipline that would have impressed any military commander. The silence that followed was somehow more intimidating than their thunderous approach had been. Margaret could feel dozens of pairs of eyes studying her cabin, evaluating threats and planning their next move. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Margaret found herself holding her breath, afraid that any movement might trigger violence. 2 hawks remained pressed against the window, his small hands flat against the glass, his expression growing more anxious with each passing second. Then Chief Running Bear dismounted from his stallion with fluid grace, his movements controlled and purposeful. He was even more imposing on foot, his height and bearing commanding respect even from his enemies. Other warriors followed his lead, though Margaret noted they kept their weapons ready and their positions strategic. The chief approached her cabin alone, stopping about 20 feet from her front door. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the distance, deep and resonant with unmistakable authority. Though he spoke in Comanche, his tone seemed less hostile than Margaret had expected, demanding rather than threatening, though the distinction might prove meaningless in the end. Two hawks suddenly pulled away from the window and ran toward the door. Margaret's heart lurched as she realized what he intended to do. Before she could stop him, he had lifted the wooden bar that secured her door and stepped outside into the morning sunlight. "No," Margaret cried, but it was too late. The boy was already walking toward his father, his injured leg causing him to limp heavily, but his head held high with unmistakable pride. Margaret watched through her window as father and son were reunited. Chief Running Bear's stern expression cracked for just a moment, revealing profound relief and love before the mask of leadership reasserted itself. He knelt down to examine his son's bandaged leg, his hands gentle despite their obvious strength. Two hawks spoke rapidly in Comanche, gesturing back toward Margaret's cabin, his tone earnest and urgent. The chief listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on his son's face with an intensity that spoke of a parent's desperate need to understand what his child had endured. When Two Hawks finished speaking, Running Bear looked up at Margaret's cabin for the first time, his gaze finding her face in the window with unerring accuracy. Margaret felt exposed under that penetrating stare, as if the chief could see into her very soul and judge her intentions, her character, her worthiness to have touched his son's life. She had heard that some Comanche leaders possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to sense truth from deception, courage from cowardice. Looking into Running Bear's eyes, she believed those stories completely. Two Hawks continued talking, his young voice carrying clearly in the still air. Though Margaret couldn't understand the words, she caught her own name several times, pronounced with the careful precision the boy had used when speaking English. She also heard what sounded like the Comanche word for coyotes, and she realized he was telling his father the full story of their encounter. Chief Running Bear rose to his feet and spoke quietly to several of his warriors. Margaret saw them nod and spread out, though their movements seemed less aggressive now, more like guards taking positions than attackers preparing to strike. The chief's attention returned to his son, and Margaret watched as Two Hawks limped back toward her cabin, his father walking slowly beside him. They stopped at her front door and Two Hawks called out in English, "Margaret, please come out. Father wants to meet the woman who saved Two Hawks." Margaret's hands shook as she set down her rifle and moved toward the door. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to maintain the barrier of walls and distance between herself and the war party. But she had come too far to show cowardice now, and something in Two Hawks' voice suggested that this confrontation might not end in violence after all. She opened the door and stepped into the morning sunlight, immediately aware of how small and vulnerable she must appear to the assembled warriors. Chief Running Bear stood before her, and this close she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 35. The paint on his face was ceremonial rather than war paint, she realized, and his weapons, while ready, were not actively threatening. The chief studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze directly, knowing that showing weakness or fear now would dishonor both herself and the kindness she had shown his son. When Running Bear finally spoke, his English was accented but clear, suggesting extensive contact with white traders or settlers. "You are the woman called Margaret," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Margaret O'Sullivan. My son tells me you saved his life, that you fought the coyotes and tended his wounds, that you gave him food and shelter and asked for nothing in return." Margaret nodded, unsure of what response was expected or appropriate. He was hurt and alone. Any decent person would have done the same. Something flickered in the chief's eyes at her words, though whether it was amusement or approval, Margaret couldn't tell. "Any decent person," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "But many of your people would not have seen a Comanche child as worthy of saving. Many would have turned away, or worse." The truth of his statement hung heavy in the air between them. Margaret had heard the stories, knew the hatred and fear that existed on both sides of the frontier conflict. Her own neighbors in Cedar Falls would likely have been horrified by her actions, viewing them as dangerous naivety at best, outright treachery at worst. "I couldn't leave a child to die," Margaret said simply. "Not any child." Chief Running Bear glanced down at his son, who was watching the exchange with obvious fascination. Two Hawks said something in Comanche, his tone respectful but insistent. The chief listened, then looked back at Margaret with an expression that seemed almost amused. "My son says you talk too much," Running Bear said. "That you told him stories about your cat and your garden, about your husband who died and your family far away. He says you cried when you cleaned his wound because you didn't want to hurt him." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She hadn't realized how much Two Hawks had understood, how carefully he had been listening to her rambling monologues during those quiet days in her cabin. I didn't know he understood so much English." "Two Hawks is wise beyond his years," the chief said with obvious pride. "He watches, he listens, he learns. These are valuable skills for a future leader of our people." The implication of those words struck Margaret with sudden force. Two Hawks wasn't just the son of a chief. He was likely being groomed as a future chief himself. She had saved not just any child, but someone who might one day lead the very tribe that white settlers feared most. "I need to understand something," Chief Running Bear continued, his tone becoming more serious. "You knew what my son was when you found him. You knew that helping him might bring danger to yourself. Why did you do it?" Margaret considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer might determine not just her own fate but possibly the future relationship between her people and his. Because he was a child in need, she said finally. Because I've lost children of my own, and I couldn't bear to let another mother lose hers if I could prevent it. Because it was the right thing to do. The chief was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. Around them, the assembled warriors waited in disciplined silence, though Margaret could sense their tension and uncertainty. This was clearly not how such encounters usually unfolded. "You speak of doing what is right," Running Bear said eventually. "But what is right for one people may be wrong for another. Your people take our land, kill our buffalo, break their promises. Our people raid your settlements, take your livestock, sometimes kill your families. Where is right in this cycle of violence?" Margaret felt the weight of history and injustice in his words, the accumulated grievances that had turned cooperation into conflict. She had no easy answers, no simple solutions to offer. "I don't know," she admitted. "I only know that when I saw your son in danger, none of that mattered. He was just a frightened child who needed help. And yet you could have been killed for showing that kindness. Some of my warriors argued for that very thing when we found his trail leading to your cabin." Margaret's blood chilled at his words, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Then why didn't they? Why are we talking instead of fighting?" Chief Running Bear smiled for the first time since their conversation began, transforming his stern features into something almost gentle. "Because Two Hawks spoke for you. Because he told us how you sang to him when he cried from pain, how you gave him your own blanket when he shivered with cold, how you prepared to take him to your people so he could find his way home safely. A child sees truth more clearly than adults sometimes." A Story Part 3. The morning sun had climbed higher as they spoke, casting longer shadows across the prairie and illuminating the remarkable scene unfolding at Margaret's homestead. 100 Comanche warriors sat motionless on their horses, their discipline absolute as they waited for their chief to conclude this unprecedented negotiation. Margaret found herself marveling at their restraint, knowing that a single wrong word or gesture could still turn this peaceful encounter into a massacre. Chief Running Bear gestured toward her cabin with obvious curiosity. "Two Hawks described your home to us. He says you live alone here, far from your own people. This is unusual for a woman of your kind." Margaret nodded, suddenly aware of how her situation must appear to a man from a culture where community and family ties were paramount. "My husband died shortly after we arrived. I chose to stay and honor his dream of building something here." "A dangerous choice," the chief observed, "but perhaps a brave one. Two Hawks says you are not afraid of hard work, that you built much of this homestead with your own hands." "I had little choice," Margaret replied with a slight smile. "It was either learn to use tools or starve." Running Bear's expression grew thoughtful. "Among my people, A woman alone would be cared for by her clan, protected and provided for until she chose another husband or returned to her father's lodge. Your people leave you to struggle alone. The question touched on painful truths about Margaret's situation that she rarely allowed herself to contemplate. Her husband's family had indeed expected her to return east after his death, to accept their charity and live as a dependent relative. Her own family had written repeatedly, begging her to abandon what they saw as a foolish and dangerous venture. Only her stubborn independence had kept her on the frontier, though the isolation was sometimes overwhelming. "It was my choice," she said carefully, "though I admit it's been difficult at times." Two hawks had been listening intently to their conversation, his young face serious as he absorbed the adult complexities being discussed. Now he spoke up in Comanche, addressing his father with obvious earnestness. Running Bear listened, asked a few quiet questions, then nodded slowly. "My son asks me to explain something to you," the chief said to Margaret. "He says you may not understand the significance of what has happened here, the debt that now exists between our peoples." Margaret waited, sensing that she was about to learn something important about Comanche culture and values. When someone saves the life of a chief's son, particularly the future leader of the tribe, it creates what we call a blood debt, Running Bear explained. This is not the same as the debts your people understand, money owed or favors to be repaid. This is a sacred obligation that binds families and clans across generations. The weight of his words settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. She had acted out of simple human compassion, but she was beginning to understand that her actions had created consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked, though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know the answer. "It means that you and your descendants are under the protection of my family and my tribe," Running Bear said solemnly. "Any harm that comes to you will be answered by us. Any need you have that we can meet becomes our responsibility. This bond cannot be broken by distance or time or even death." Margaret stared at him in amazement, trying to process the full implications of what he was saying. "But I didn't do it for any reward or protection. I just couldn't let a child suffer." "Which is exactly why the debt is so binding," the chief replied. "You acted without thought of gain, without calculating advantage. You risked your life for a child of your enemy simply because it was right. Such actions create the strongest bonds of all." Around them, the assembled warriors had begun to show signs of restlessness, though their discipline remained absolute. Margaret realized that this conversation, however significant to her personally, was keeping a large war party from whatever business had originally brought them to this part of the territory. As if reading her thoughts, Running Bear glanced back at his men. "We were hunting raiders," he explained. "Apache war party that stole horses from our herd and killed 2 of our young men. The trail led this direction, which is how we came to be in this area when 2 Hawks' tracks were discovered." Margaret felt a chill of realization. If Apache raiders were in the area, her isolated homestead could easily become a target. She had been so focused on the immediate danger presented by the Comanche war party that she hadn't considered other threats that might be lurking in the vast emptiness of the frontier. "Are they still out there?" she asked, glancing nervously toward the horizon. "The trail is 2 days old, heading south toward the canyon country," Running Bear replied. "But Apache are clever fighters. They may have doubled back or split their forces. It would not be safe for you to remain here alone." The practical implications of the chief's warning began to sink in. Margaret had supplies for perhaps a week if she rationed carefully, but no way to defend herself against a determined attack by multiple raiders. Her nearest neighbors were 15 miles away, too far to summon for help if trouble came calling. 2 Hawks spoke up again, his English more confident now as he grew comfortable with the conversation. "Margaret should come with us," he said earnestly. "Father, you said she is under our protection now. How can we protect her if we leave her here alone?" The suggestion hung in the air like a spark near tinder, pregnant with possibilities and dangers that Margaret couldn't fully comprehend. The idea of traveling with a Comanche war party was both terrifying and oddly appealing. She would certainly be safe from Apache raiders, but what would happen when they reached the main Comanche camp? How would she be received by people who had no reason to trust or welcome a white woman? Chief Running Bear considered his son's words carefully, his expression revealing the complexity of the decision he faced. 2 Hawks speaks wisdom," he said finally. "But such a choice would change your life forever, Margaret O'Sullivan. You could not simply visit our camp and then return to your old life unchanged. There are some boundaries that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed." Margaret felt the full weight of the moment pressing down on her. Everything she had worked for over the past months was here at this homestead. Her husband's dream, her independence, her connection to the life she had chosen. But what kind of life could she have here now, constantly looking over her shoulder for raiders, jumping at every sound in the night? "What would happen to me if I came with you?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness in even considering the possibility. "You would be welcomed as a member of our extended family," Running Bear replied. "The blood debt ensures that. You would have a place in our camp, protection from our warriors, and the respect due to one who saved a chief's son. But you would also be expected to live by our customs, to contribute to the welfare of the tribe, to accept the ways of our people." Margaret tried to imagine herself in a Comanche village, surrounded by people whose language she didn't speak, whose customs she barely understood. The practical challenges alone seemed overwhelming. How would she communicate? What skills could she offer? How would she adapt to a completely different way of life? I need time to think, she said finally. This is not a decision I can make quickly. Time is something we may not have, Running Bear pointed out. The Apache Trail grows colder with each hour, and leaving you here unprotected becomes more dangerous as word spreads that a lone white woman lives in this place. As if to emphasize his point, one of the warriors who had been scouting the perimeter rode up and spoke urgently in Comanche. Margaret couldn't understand the words, but the tension that immediately gripped both Running Bear and Two Hawks told her the news wasn't good. "What is it?" she asked, though she feared she already knew. "Smoke," Running Bear said grimly, "rising from the direction of your town. Either someone is burning brush or—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized what the smoke might mean. Cedar Falls, with its handful of families and modest businesses, would be helpless against a determined Apache raid. If the raiders had struck there, how many people might already be dead? "We have to help them," Margaret said instinctively, then immediately realized the absurdity of her words. What help could a Comanche war party provide to a white settlement under attack? Their arrival would more likely be seen as a second wave of assault than as rescue. Running Bear seemed to read her thoughts. "Your people would not welcome our aid," he said quietly. "They would assume we were part of the attack, or taking advantage of their weakness to launch our own raid. The fear and hatred run too deep on both sides." Margaret felt the crushing weight of futility settling over her. People were possibly dying just 15 miles away, and there was nothing she could do to help them. The barriers between cultures, the legacy of violence and mistrust, made even the most basic cooperation impossible. Two Hawks had been listening to the exchange with growing distress, his young face reflecting the same frustration Margaret felt. "This is wrong," he said suddenly, his English passionate despite its imperfection. "Good people die because others cannot see past old anger." His words struck Margaret with sudden inspiration. Maybe there was something she could do after all, a way to bridge the gap between peoples that seemed so impossible to cross. "What if I went with a small group of your warriors?" she suggested to Running Bear. "If I rode in first, showed that I was unharmed, maybe I could convince them that you came to help, not to attack." The chief stared at her as if she had suggested flying to the moon. "You would risk your life on such a slim chance. Your own people might kill you as a traitor before you could explain." "Maybe," Margaret admitted. "But if there's even a small possibility of preventing more bloodshed, isn't it worth trying?" Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the same internal struggle Margaret had seen in his son. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well. We will try this thing you suggest, but we go prepared for treachery as well as peace." The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity as Running Bear selected a small group of his most trusted warriors and explained the plan to the rest of the war party. Margaret gathered her few essential possessions, including the precious letters from her family and the small Bible her mother had given her as a wedding gift. She had no idea when or if she would see her cabin again, but somehow that seemed less important than the lives that might hang in the balance. As she prepared to mount one of the spare horses the Comanche had brought, Margaret caught sight of two hawks watching her with obvious concern. Despite his youth, he seemed to understand the risks she was taking, the bridges she was burning in her attempt to prevent more violence. "Will you be all right?" he asked quietly, his English careful but heartfelt. Margaret smiled and touched his shoulder gently. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I have to try. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking chances, even when you're scared." Two hawks nodded solemnly, as if her words confirmed something he had already suspected about the adult world and its complicated moral choices. "Father says courage is not the absence of fear, but doing what must be done despite the fear." "Your father is a wise man," Margaret replied, then looked up to find Chief Running Bear watching their exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Are you ready?" he asked simply. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would change everything. "Yes," she said and meant it. Story Part 4. The ride toward Cedar Falls was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. She found herself part of a tight formation of 12 Comanche warriors, their horses moving with synchronized precision across the prairie landscape. Chief Running Bear rode beside her, his presence both reassuring and intimidating as they approached what might be their mutual doom. The smoke they had seen from Margaret's homestead was indeed coming from the direction of town, though as they drew closer it became clear that the entire settlement wasn't burning. Instead, columns of dark smoke rose from what appeared to be 2 or 3 specific locations, suggesting targeted attacks rather than wholesale destruction. "Barn fires," Running Bear observed grimly. "Apache raiders often burn storage buildings to deny resources to their enemies. They may have taken what they wanted and moved on, or they may still be in the area." Margaret's stomach twisted with anxiety as she thought about the families she knew in Cedar Falls. The Hendersons with their 3 young children, old Sam Martinez who ran the general store, the Reverend Williams and his wife who had been so kind to her after Thomas's death. Were they safe, or had some of them already paid the ultimate price for living on the contested frontier? As they crested a low hill that offered a view of the settlement, Margaret's worst fears seemed confirmed. Cedar Falls lay spread out below,